You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from Icons, where listeners are introduced to incredible people working within the law enforcement community who have made a profound impact in our world. These one-on-one interviews provide insight into their lives and careers so we can better understand their challenges and recognize their bravery, commitment, and sacrifice. Welcome to Precinct 444. I'm Christopher Mitchell, the producer of Precinct 444 and manager of digital content and strategy at the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today's series is truly a special one. As we're nearing the end of Pride Month, we here at the Precinct wanted to leave a lasting impression on everyone by releasing the 6 full oral histories of the participants featured in the digital exhibit Experience Pride Behind the Badge, the history of LGBTQIA+ in law enforcement, published today. A link to the exhibit can be found in the episode descriptions from this series. If you're listening to these episodes on the original published date, a companion program is set to air this coming Wednesday, June 28th at 2 p.m. Be sure to register using the link found in the episode descriptions. The purpose behind these projects is to share the often untold stories of LGBTQIA+ and law enforcement through their own words. They come from all walks of life and all types of law enforcement. Episode 3 of this series features Julie Callahan. She discusses transgender challenges in law enforcement, transitioning, and her overall experiences during her 40 years in law enforcement. And now for part 3 of Pride Behind the Badge featuring Julie Callahan.
I guess what made me want to get into it was the interaction that I had with the police and sheriffs and the park rangers, and the influence that they had on me at a very young age, that this was a very positive thing and it was an exciting job. My brother was a CHP cadet back in the mid to late 1970s. And I got a little indoctrinated into some of the law enforcement officers and culture back then, and it seemed very interesting to me. I was a lifeguard at a pool and then at a county beach for a period of time, and had a lot of interaction with state parks police and sheriffs and police officers and what have you, and it seemed like a really interesting job. So I became a reserve police officer for a small city in the San Francisco Bay Area, and that was a really good learning experience for me. I was a administration of justice major at the time, and I felt that that was my calling, then that was where I was going to go. So I started applying for police officer positions, and actually a cadet position because I was too young to get hired as a police officer at the time. I was 19 years old and was able to be hired as a reserve officer, but not as a regular officer at this department. So I went through the testing process, and they were hiring police cadets, and that was the position I tested for. So I started testing for that position. Part of the process was a polygraph, and I went into a polygraph and started answering questions, and they were very, very pointed questions about my gender identity and cross-dressing and things like that, which I answered very honestly and promptly was asked to resign. I got out of law enforcement at that point, basically afraid to address some of those issues because I really wasn't willing to address the issue of my gender identity stuff. Publicly or privately. And I thought that I could, push it back and it would go away sooner or later. And it didn't. But I ended up a couple years later pursuing a law enforcement job. I was hired in the San Francisco Bay Area as a police officer and went through the academy in the early 1980s. And my career took off from there. I was in law enforcement with that agency for 30 years, and then with another agency after that for another 10.
Right. Yeah. And I was, wondering about if you had any reservations as someone who identifies as LGBTQ plus. Did you have any reservations about entering law enforcement? Because that was obviously a very difficult time for LGBTQ plus in the 1980s.
Right. For somebody who's transgender and is not out, it's a very different situation because other people generally don't know who you are, and disclosing that information is really problematic because you may not be prepared to do anything about it, but the agency's asking that information from you. So I had concerns, but I wasn't thinking about transitioning genders at the time. Most of the vocabulary that's come about didn't exist back then. So trying to put this into words was really difficult for me. Even internally, being able to explain it to myself or speak to a counselor, let alone anybody else. I mean, it was just a very terrifying thing to think about coming out at that time. I had seen other officers who who had transitioned on the news and the problems that they were having. And I mean, these were very brave individuals, especially at that time. And the next 10 years or so. So I mean, it was a scary time for a lot of people. Definitely, it was for me.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I mean, did you personally have any experiences within that first department or at any point really in your earlier career where you just felt like, maybe this wasn't it? Or did you, like a lot of law enforcement professionals, know that this was the career that you wanted to stay in? I mean, obviously you did, because you ended up serving for over 40 years and you're still, contributing to law enforcement and LGBTQ officers.
Um, I didn't think about leaving the profession for those reasons, but I did think about, before I transitioned, before anyone at the agency knew that I was transgender, I thought about changing jobs and professions for a short period of time. And basically, what it boiled down to was I had a sense of entitlement to some degree that I belonged in this position, that I had fought hard and worked hard at it, and that I was good at it. And I didn't want to go do anything else. This is what I was meant to be doing. And I had a very, very long and happy career at both agencies. So no, I don't think it didn't have any influence. It did give me room for reservation when I was thinking about transitioning, because I would sit in a room and listen to the other officers talk about transgender people or LGBT people at that point too, in a very negative way, in a very negative light. And, nobody knew I was trans. And I sat back and I listened to that and I went, oh, this is not going to go well at all. And it was scary. I mean, I'm sure it's very scary for people who are still considering transitioning in mid-career. It's problematic. You worry about what your peers are going to do, whether they're going to fill with you, whether they're going to attack you, whether they're going to ostracize you. And, all of those things are possible and they do happen. I mean, I've had some of those things happen to me. So the isolation becomes really problematic and is scary, and it's not something you understand up front, but it's something you feel after you've disclosed, certainly.
Did you have any other friends who were, in law enforcement also, that were either transitioning or were thinking about transitioning?
I first reached out to a deputy sheriff in the same county. who was a reserve deputy, and she was an attorney as well in her normal day job. She was an attorney. And she had transitioned probably 5 years before I did, and was well received at the sheriff's office there where she worked. But she was the first person that I reached out to. And then I began networking at that point and started reaching out. And this is at the onset and advent of the internet. So I would reach out and try and contact people in chat rooms and things like that. I was more successful by word of mouth and using the telephone to contact other officers or agents or deputies. And that was really how I began. Well, I met a professor from Southern Police Institute who was conducting a study on transgender officers that way. And through some of those contacts, and then I developed more contacts after the study had been completed, and he put us all in contact with one another. And so we had a email thread going on for a period of time and shared information about our lives, our experiences, the things that we're going through with our work. People who had transitioned shared their experiences and what worked and what didn't work. And those of us who had not transitioned and had not disclosed to anybody were really, I mean, it was an educational thing, but it was so heartening to listen to other people go through the same experiences that we were contemplating. And, when you transition genders, it's not always something you have a lot of control over emotionally or practically, but you can control the information as to the degree that you can, and the flow of that information and who you're contacting. And those experiences were really positive for me. They gave me hope that I could transition and still can keep my job.
Right. And you entered it in the 1980s, and I've heard from other officers, and did you see any changes somewhat early on in the 1980s?
Police department that I worked at did not have an out gay officer until 2012.
Wow, 2012.
I am dead serious. I came out in 2001. We've had out lesbian officers. Matter of fact, at the time, we had an out lesbian deputy chief. And there was a sizable contingent of female officers who were family. They were not very in your face about it. They were very quiet, but they had their own little group, a social group that was, I guess, within the lesbian community there at the PD. And that was very heartening to some degree for me, because at least it was somebody within the LGBTQ community that I could go to and seek support. But it was not anything that people would advertise. Definitely not. I mean, it was, okay, I know so-and-so's a lesbian, but it wasn't like they were organized, even loosely organized in private, yes, but in public, no. And the gay officers, like I said, to this day, there's probably only a handful that are out, and they're very quiet about it. And it's just I know at least, well, let's see. We'll talk about gay male officers. There's probably about 5 or so, but there were more than a dozen that I know of who were very closeted, who were scared to death to come out, and felt as though that their health and safety would be compromised if they were to come out on the job.
And I mean, it's one thing to actually have policy because you know that maybe the higher ups of the department itself may protect you like legally, but personally and emotionally, it doesn't mean that the other deputies or the other officers are going to necessarily have your back. So I can't imagine what that would be like. But I
don't remember what year San Jose's policy came out about non-discrimination for LGBT officers. And there was a transgender policy that was written basically because I came out. So that issue was forced, but there was no inclusion of sexual orientation or gender identity in the department's duty manual or the city's duty manual at that time. And that didn't occur until probably 5 to 7 years later, shortly before I retired from the agency. But I mean, it was still a big bone of contention for many officers who did not feel like they could come out, but didn't want to live in the closet anymore. And I mean, that went with the trans officers too. Over the years, I've learned of many transgender officers at San Jose PD. And, it was shocking to me because, I mean, none of these people came and talked to me when I transitioned. These were all after I retired from the department. It was problematic for me. It hurt that none of these people felt like they could come to me and say, hey, I'm trans too. The first one that did was a retiree who was probably in her 80s and she had retired before I was hired. And then when the white paper came out that I was transitioning, that person called me on the phone after writing me and wrote a note, and then called me on the phone, and we had a conversation about that from her retirement home out of state. And it was painful listening to her because she was still hurting and had not transitioned, had basically gone through life keeping these stories or her feelings inside her without being able to express them. So, that was a problem. And I mean, over the years, I've had people contact me, or we've run across each other at different venues and I learned of their identity, and they already knew who I was at that point. I mean, I had transitioned years before for some of these people. And it was, I don't want to say shocking, but certainly it caught me by surprise that some of these people were transgender, because I know people say, oh, well, I can tell. Well, no, you can't. Really? A lot of these, the transgender people, especially those that have not transitioned, you would have absolutely no idea unless they let it be known. You just wouldn't. One of the things that kept me from transitioning before I actually went through it was that I was working at the airport shortly after 9/11, and I had already transitioned, and I was sitting in a shuttle van moving from the airport division office up to the terminals. And there was probably a dozen officers in this vehicle, and they were talking about being at a bar and meeting a transgender woman, and one of the officers knew that she was transgender, quote unquote, and actually groped the individual and is telling the story in front of me, knowing that I've already transitioned. And there were two other female officers sitting in the vehicle. We all kind of looked at each other like, oh my God, did he just say that? And he says, well, I can always tell. the fact of the matter is that you can't. And I've had other issues with officers along my career. Mostly when I first transitioned, I had I went to a family fight in a parking lot, and I was calling for help because I was fighting with two people, male and a female, and the male had hit and dragged the female by her hair, and I was interceding to help stop the violence and free the female from the guy so she didn't get hurt. And when I did that, she jumped on my back while I was trying to arrest him. Long story short, I call for help on the radio. An officer, or nobody responds, and they step on me, meaning that they're keying the mic while I'm calling for help, which covers my transmission so nobody can hear it, which is really frustrating. Anyway, a few minutes later, I see a police car pull in, and I'm quite happy to see this person because I'm still fighting with these two people. And this is like 3 minutes later, and 3 minutes in a knockdown, drag out fight is not a pleasant place to be when you're by yourself. The officer parks his car. He gets out of the car, and I'm fighting still. He walks to the front of his car and sits down on the push bar, and he is now watching us fight. He's not taking any affirmative action to come help me. And I was able to deal with both individuals. He did come over and help after I handcuffed the first person. But we had a chat afterwards. And we had a chat in private, in which time I called him a few names, and one of them included being a coward. And I was really put back by the fact that he would not engage, and asked him why. And he said that he wanted to make sure I could still handle myself. Now, I'd been a cop for 20 years, and I had been a cop on the east side of San Jose for majority of that time, and I was a detective for a good part of that time. I had been involved in many critical incidences and always had taken care of business. I made sure that myself and the other officers were safe. I made sure that the public was safe as best I could in all instances, and had never showed any cowardice or hesitation to jump into a fight. And for this guy to do that was just insulting. And it was frustrating, but it was scary too, because I didn't know who else I could trust. And I think that was a big thing. So it was one of the things I've carried with me all this time, which is basically the only person I can rely upon is myself until somebody else proves differently.
Right. And how long had you known the person that actually responded?
He's probably been on 10 years or so.
So I mean, he definitely knew you. Like he
knew my evil twin brother. Yeah, he knew me.
Wow, that's unbelievable. I mean, and did you know about like other departments and like obviously you had a lot of friends, who were either transitioning or who hadn't transitioned and who hadn't come out yet, and were they sort of experiencing the same thing in their departments, whether that was in California or elsewhere throughout the United States?
There were a few that had absolutely no real problems that they ever shared with me. There were a substantial number who had different kinds of, but similar experiences. And I would say that's probably the most common, is that, people lose sight of the fact that you're the same person. they lose sight of the fact that you have the same experiences and abilities, and that the only thing that has really changed is their perception of what you look like and who you feel like inside, which has nothing to do with you doing the job. That's I think the biggest thing for people to understand is that transgender people tend to be overachievers. We tend to be people who got into this profession to hide, and well, maybe not got into it to hide, but when we got into it, we found that we hid very easily within the profession, and we could basically keep the gender that we were born with, without necessarily sharing the gender we identified as. And I'm not sure if that makes any sense to you, but not all of us wanted to transition. Some people were forced to transition. Others of us got to a point where emotionally the dichotomy and the conflict that we had in our gender became so intense that we had to deal with it. And that is a very strong, stressful, very difficult situation for anybody to have to deal with solely internally. And so eventually those feelings and emotions come out and you have to address them. And, for me, there was a lot of therapy involved. There was a lot of introspection. People thought this was a snap judgment. This was for me, I transitioned when I was about 40, right around my 40th year. But I had been dealing with gender issues all my life, and I couldn't put a word to it back then, but probably since I was like 4 years old, knew that I was gender different. And, those experiences, those feelings, I was taught early on were not permissible to share with other people, and that they were inappropriate. You get disciplined by your parents for expressing those feelings and things like that. And that was, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So yeah, I mean, those kind of things are very difficult. And I would say that my peers probably had very similar experiences as they transitioned at their agencies. So, and back then we didn't have anybody that was hired as trans. That's a recent phenomenon. You get youthful adolescents, young adults that transition and have come into law enforcement. It's a great thing. Don't get me wrong. It's really nice to see, but it's certainly a different experience than somebody who's 40 years old going through it. So, or older. I know we just had a officer in Portland, Maine that transitioned last week, and that particular officer's in their 60s and just got to the point where they could not live that lie any longer, and basically had to deal with it. And they did transition. By all reports, they're doing very well, and I'm very happy for them.
Right. Yeah, that's great to hear. It's so unfortunate they had to wait until they were 60 years old. I mean, it's like you can tell that there have been significant changes and progress over the last 30, 40 years, with now departments are, hate to say willing, but it seems like they're definitely more open and more inclusive to hiring those that are just willing to serve. And that should have always been the bottom line, that if you're willing to serve, then you should be hired on, assuming you pass, all of the check boxes of being a police officer. But
oh yeah, and that's really difficult, especially for trans people. I mean, if you have a background, and depending on who's doing your background, whether they like you or don't like you, or against LGBT people or whatever, I mean, they can get rid of you for whatever reason they feel is appropriate. And I mean, sometimes you can argue that. And most of the time, that's not the case. So if somebody's biased against transgender people, you may not get hired. You may never get to that point.
Yeah, and the departments are never going to be open about that because they're not going to straight up say that that's why you're being fired.
Oh, absolutely.
Even though it's in their policy, because they can make up any excuse under the sun to get rid of you.
Right. And you get a lot of background, or a lot of agencies use private contractors to do their backgrounds, and the private contractors are usually retirees that are working as or for private investigation companies, and they do law enforcement backgrounds. Now, these are people that are, probably in their 50s, 60s, and 70s doing background investigations, and probably are not the most open about including LGBT people in the workforce. Many of them have very strong feelings against it, and that creates its own set of issues. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a problem as well within law enforcement, and how things change over time, but sometimes that change comes very slow. Leadership sets the tone, and going down the chain, everybody else kind of falls in line with that frame of or way of thinking. Not always, but good many agencies find comfort in doing that and keeping the brotherhood together. And I mean, it was like when women came into policing as well. We're at a point in law enforcement where we're having a hard time trying to get people coming into this job for a lot of reasons. And we cannot afford to exclude people because of their ethnicity, their gender, their sexual orientation, their religion, their, all these different attributes that people have in the human condition. And we cannot afford to exclude any of those groups from coming into this job if we want to continue and recruit people from our community, from those communities that we serve. And, it's a pretty broad base of places, depending on where you live and where you are in the United States, especially. But, we can't afford to exclude those people.
Right. It's about representation. It's about who they're serving in those communities, and, who do you want, showing up when you're trying to call the police to help you with something, and there's somebody who, you can't really relate to. It's a white man, and maybe you are a trans woman, and you're like, well, I don't really feel comfortable with talking to a man about the issues I'm experiencing, especially with trans women, and especially Black trans women, and all of the, I mean, there's so many different number of adjectives I can use to describe the amount of persecution they've received over the last 15, 20, 30 years, because it's just ongoing. It's really heartbreaking to read about the stories.
I help run the Trans Death Investigations Project, and we look at the people who are being killed within the transgender community, and it generally is non-white women for the most part, but men as well. I mean, we get a lot of Black trans men who are being killed, and we look at it at a bigger picture of just basically the violent deaths of transgender people, but there's a significant portion of them that are Black. And that is just a horrible statistic, and it says terrible things about who we are as a community, who we are in society. Just a short story. I worked a beat in, I wouldn't call it the gay section of San Jose, but it was where the LGBT center was. And that was my beat for basically 8 years. And so I had a lot of interaction with the community, and this was after I transitioned, so people pretty much knew who I was. And there was a degree of comfort in having me around and what have you. I had a gay couple, who were frequent flyers. And basically, I would respond to disturbances with these two individuals on a fairly regular basis. They were probably violent before I got there in the beginning, but I found them out on the street having knockdown, drag out fights, and eventually had to, intercede. So basically, the straight officers that responded to those things would taunt these guys mercilessly, and it was like the couple times that I interceded was like, hey, if you don't mind, I'll take over this one, because I felt like I could do the situation justice without giving these guys grief, more than what they deserve, which is that they did something bad, they were dealt with. They were both given resources. They were told to go to counseling. They were told, these are domestic violence resources, please go to them. But those were things that the straight officers were not given these guys at all, because they didn't believe their relationship was real, quote unquote. And it's like, get over it. These are two people who are going through some relationship issues, and they may or may not need to be together anymore, but that's not for you to decide. That's for someone else to decide. And they should get the same resources as anyone else does. That being said, the snickers and the lack of caring or the lack of compassion was really problematic for me when I was watching some of these things before stepping in. And I mean, I would step in and say, hey, I'll take over. I got it. And they were happy for me to take the paper, for me to write the reports or make the arrest or whatever. But I knew at least it was going to get taken care of the right way. And, no one was being persecuted. Basically, they, if there was a mistake made, they made a mistake and they were going to be held to account for it. And, you separate people for the evening, and hopefully they can get back to a point where they're not violent. And, that was always a concern for me when I went to these things, that you see officers, transgender people being stopped by officers for various reasons. And the officers just did not get it. This is a human being, regardless of your disdain for this individual. And, that's really a problem right there. But regardless of your disdain, treat them like you would anybody else, address the issues that you have to address and move on, and that's generally not what happened. And, I kind of grew up with that when I became a police officer and saw it, and that was shocking. It really was. It was something that caused me to really examine whether I wanted to transition or not at the department, because I felt like I would be treated the same way. And while I was not to the same degree, I was to some degree.
But I also wanted to ask you about TCOPS International and see if you can talk about,
Sure.
this study a little bit. I think from 1998, if I'm not mistaken, and talk about how that sort of came to be and how you were able to kind of create TCOPS and kind of where you're at with TCOPS International now.
Okay. So in about 1997 or so, I was having a conversation with a transgender deputy who had transitioned on the job. And she basically told me, hey, there's this individual I was contacted by who's a professor at Southern Police Institute who's doing a study on transgender officers. Would you be interested in participating? And I told her that I would. So she put him in contact with me. And I had, we're still friends to this day. I mean, as many of the people who were involved in the study were, we became friends after the study was completed and what have you, but we stayed in contact and exchanged messages on a pretty regular basis. That person started his study, And the study included about 20 or so transgender officers from the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand. And when he was finished with his study, everybody had asked him, hey, can you put me in contact with the other officers so we can talk? So he put together an email thread, and we started chatting back and forth and sharing experiences, particularly experiences about transitioning on the job, acceptance, policy, procedure, what the agency's problems were, how to address them, etc. So we started conversing back and forth, and that email thread, basically I got to the point where I got frustrated with the email thread, and I said, hey, look, there's this thing called Yahoo Groups. Let's try that. So I made a Yahoo group, and I was joined by about maybe a dozen or more officers initially, and then we began a recruiting process of recruiting other transgender officers and identifying who these officers were, and basically reaching out to them and saying, hey, we have a support group if you're interested. And while I facilitated and got the group started, there was a core group of about 20 of us or so. And we all basically chipped in and provided peer support for one another, because we all ran into the same kind of personal issues and professional issues along the way. And those kind of interactions and that kind of support was extremely helpful for me and for the other officers. So we continued and we built from that, and we identified almost 7,000 transgender officers over the last 22 years. So I think 6,800. And about 3,900 of those are in the United States. Probably about 400 of those transitioned genders in the United States at agencies here. So state, local, federal agencies all have transgender people who have transitioned in them. And the peer support grew to some educational things and advocacy. We began advising agencies as well as individuals on how to plan their gender transitions and how to process a gender transition within an agency, what works, what doesn't work. And those things became part of what TCOPS is now. We were a nonprofit for a number of years. Because of the political environment, we closed down the group as a nonprofit and remain a standalone peer support group based on the internet that I run and pay for. It's kind of a labor of love to some degree for me.
And how many of the original 20 do you still keep in contact with, and how many of them are still involved?
I would say probably there's a core group of 10 of us that are still involved. We've had a few that have passed away. We've had several, almost all of us are retired now. I think all of us are retired now that I'm thinking about it. There's one in the UK that I think is at retirement now. She's getting ready to retire. But we do stay in touch. Most of them are on my board of advisors for the group. So, I mean, we bounce things off of each other. We try to keep in mind that, people don't always reach out when they need help. They reach out when they're in crisis, and you end up having to deal with the big emotional mess first and then deal with some of the other issues afterwards. So we have some mental health components to our outreach and our peer support group as well. So we do a bunch of different things. We have a transition workshop. We have a memorial page for our members who've passed. We have a book and resource page. We have a wellness group. I mean, there's a bunch of different things that we do. One of them is a crisis hotline. And we're in the process of trying to we're partnering with a university to develop a crisis hotline for LGBT first responders, because the LGBT community has resources for mental health issues, but they don't like cops. You tell them you're a cop and you're outcast, basically. They don't want anything to do with you. And the one transgender hotline basically cussed me out on the phone. I had to hang up on them because they were that horrible about dealing with law enforcement. And this was probably shortly, maybe a month or two after George Floyd died, that we started calling around looking for places that would provide support in crisis situations for our members. And they were hostile, very hostile towards us. So they were no longer a resource. And we reached out to a bunch of other community resources. They were not good. So then we looked and turned towards the law enforcement crisis resources, and they were great for cops. But if you told them you were LGBTQ, they were like, what? So, they were not really understanding. Not that they didn't know what LGBTQ meant, although we did have to explain it a number of times. But they were like, so you're gay and you're in a relationship with another man and you're having problems and now you're suicidal. We don't really deal with that, even if you're a cop. And so we went, well, that's a problem. We can't send people there either. And, if you make that situation a transgender person, they're hands off. They just don't want to deal with it at all. So we found that we were not finding any resources for our membership within either of those two structures of the crisis support networks. And now we're looking at developing our own. So we've done that. We've done a number of things. We were working with the American College of Environmental and Occupational Medicine and helped write a chapter on fitness for duty for transgender law enforcement officers, which is a resource for physicians and psychologists and people involved in the hiring process and or in-service treatment of law enforcement officers who are transgender. Law enforcement officers, period. And then there's a chapter on how to deal with transgender officers. We're pretty proud of that work. Let's see, what else do we have? We have the Trans Death Investigations Project, which we work on. And basically what we do is we look at the individual homicides. We try to collect as much information as we can. Sometimes we're able to get reports, most of the time not. We have to go by media releases, but we identify who the decedents are, we identify who perpetrators are, and we look for commonalities to determine if there are serial killers. We also look to see that agencies do not let cases go cold. And if they are, to have them revisit those cases, to look at their evidence and look at who their potential suspects are. So we do that as well. one that we're working on is a transgender missing and murdered project. So the missing transgender people have kind of fallen through the crack, and we're using that site as a conduit or kind of a data collection point for the murdered transgender people and that particular thing. And then the last one is the transition workshop. And our transition workshop basically allows transgender officers or gender questioning officers who are contemplating coming into or transitioning on their agency or coming into law enforcement. It gives them the place to ask questions and to get resources on how to transition, how to plan your transition, what kind of things will come up, and then all the little roadblocks that agencies and background investigators and academies place in the way of a transgender person when they're trying to just get a job and basically, do their law enforcement job, something that's a calling for them. So we're dealing with that. And then we do deal with policy development for state, federal, and local agencies, mostly in the US, but I mean, we do cross in national borders, especially into Canada and into the United Kingdom, to a lesser degree in Australia and in New Zealand. But we do deal with them. We work with PERF and US DOJ cops pretty regularly on various topics related in some manner to transgender people. Yeah, we have what we found is the great preponderance of people that come to our group are people that would be classified as transsexual, I guess, which is an old passé term, but it basically means people who are changing their bodies to match their gender identity. And that's the preponderance of people that come into the group. But we also have a component for cross-dressers, which are people who are basically like dressing as the opposite gender. And we find that we have a huge amount of law enforcement officers that are filled within that category. And we have a place for them in our groups as well. And we found that that's a pretty active little group. Yeah, there's a criteria to come into the group. Basically, you have to be an active duty, retired, or former law enforcement officer. If you're a former law enforcement officer, you have to be in good standing with your agency. You have to be able to provide some form of verification that you were in this law enforcement occupation. Whether, there's a bunch of different things that we ask for. You only have to give us one, but we need something. And then you have to be able to explain that they're transgender, genderqueer, gender fluid, gender non-conforming, any gender questioning, any of those different variations within the transgender spectrum. At that point, if we have a comfort level with you, we'll bring you into the group. If we don't, we may ask for other questions and what have you. But there is a validation process. And then we do education, like we do podcasts like this, but I did one recently for another law enforcement agency in California the other day, a large law enforcement agency, for their internal podcast. And that was kind of interesting. So we do projects like that as well.
Do you have any advice for new LGBTQ plus officers and those thinking of becoming law enforcement professionals?
I think people need to have a good understanding of what the job really entails and not the romanticized version of what a cop does. What you see on TV isn't always what what happens in law enforcement. It is a lifestyle. It's not, it's a lifestyle and a career. It's not just a job. And I mean, if you come into it because it's a well-paying job, you're going to have some probably unfulfilled expectations about it, and you may not last very long. But I would say come into it with your eyes open and understand what the job really entails. And it's not an easy job, but it's a very fulfilling job.
Well, Julie, thank you for the insightful conversation and definitely for your time today so we could kind of rehash the kind of transgender experience in law enforcement. And I have one last ask of you, if you don't mind. Is there anything else you would want people to know about your experience in law enforcement?
Number one, we're people, we're human beings, and we're deserving of a degree of dignity just like anybody else is. We have families, we have children, we have parents and brothers and sisters and spouses and friends. And I think that people lose sight of that. They only see, well, you're transgender or you're gay or you're lesbian or you're bisexual or you're queer, and having to explain our community to a straight person, sometimes it's not the easiest thing to do because they sit there and they'll make faces or they'll, basically give you some kind of derogatory comment. Just because my life is not exactly like yours does not mean that my life is to be disregarded or disrespected, for that matter. Because I'm transgender does not mean that you should think I'm a bad person. So, and that's an example, more, I guess, an example than anything else. But people forget that. It's like, oh, well, what I'm doing over here doesn't matter, but what you're doing over here is wrong. It's not for you to decide. It's for me and my maker to decide when I get to that point. So anyway, I guess I would want people to know that we're very caring people. We are overachievers generally. We are very good at what we do as I would say majority of the trans officers that I've met have been homicide detectives and SWAT officers and sexual assault investigators and narcotics officers or whatever. They've done very, very well in their job specialties, and they've served for years. Most of us have gone through our careers and retired out of law enforcement, and we get a good many people that transition after they retire. So know that we are maybe not what you would meet on the street. I think most law enforcement officers, the only experience they have with transgender people are the criminal element or the people that we meet as customers out on the street, whether it's a family disturbance or some other kind of situation you respond to, and you're dealing with the transgender person. The officer looks down on them. They automatically are very judgmental, and I think that's a disservice to the individual, but it's a disservice to the community as well. We have to look beyond that. We can't just identify a bad person just because they fall within the transgender community, because you may be sitting in the car working with somebody who's transgender and you just don't know it yet.
That was part 3 of the Pride Behind the Badge series featuring Julie Callahan. We hope you'll take some time to explore our digital exhibit, Experience Pride Behind the Badge, the history of LGBTQIA+ in law enforcement. Remember, the companion program for the digital exhibit will air on YouTube this Wednesday, June 28th at 2 p.m. The register link is in the episode description. We hope you found this conversation enlightening and will join us again for another edition of Icons, where we introduce listeners to incredible people working within law enforcement who have had a profound impact on the community. These one-on-one interviews provide insight into their lives and careers so we can better understand their challenges and recognize their bravery, commitment, and sacrifice. The Icon series is not just about contemporary figures in the law enforcement community, but about all of those who have served their communities and the world, from now and in the past. Be sure to tune back in with us for future Icons episodes exclusively on Tuesdays every month to learn about key figures in American law enforcement history. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.